And Langston Hughes, I'd written that in 1996, the music to that, and want to bring to bear, you want to lift up what's made invisible by so many folks, which is the culture and art of the African American people. So, where do we start? Well, we should start with a song, I guess. Uh, Better turn on the keyboard. Can you hear that? I got shoes, you got shoes, all God's children got shoes. When we get to heaven, gonna sing, walk, walk all over God's heaven, heaven. Everybody talking about heaven, ain't going there, heaven, heaven, heaven. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Since I laid my burden down, glory, glory, hallelujah. Since I laid my burden down, friends don't treat me like they used to since I laid my burden down. Oh, friends don't treat me like they used to since I laid my burden down. Since I laid my burden down. Amen. Uh, as a Methodist, I was influenced greatly by this book. My dad gave it to me when I was 14 and didn't really know any better. Songs of Zion, published by Abingdon Press, which is a Methodist publisher, well, under the United Methodist Publishing House and imprint. My dad, my late father's United Methodist pastor, and he wanted to share with me a resource that I have to say, since its publication in 1980, has been an incredible guidepost for worshiping across denominations. This book has actually gone much farther than just the United Methodist or Methodist family, even. Only supplanted, probably in recent years, by the African American Heritage Hymnal, published by GIA. Both of them are great resources. In this book, there's the section on spirituals, where they came from, how they emerged. Negro spirituals, folk songs, jubilee songs, they've been called anthems. In fact, they might have been called anthems at the very beginning. These songs emerge from a people stripped of just about everything. People that were, of course, made to feel that like they weren't human, that what they brought with themselves was not honored or needed. What was needed was work, and what was needed was subservience, and what was needed was to obey. And incredibly, amazingly, these songs have come to us. They're great gifts that have come to us. They're from an oral tradition. So from the tradition of orality, we don't have names that are put to these songs. We didn't. We don't know the names of those who wrote them. And I'd like to point out, though, as a bit of a music historian, that individual composers is a kind of a recent phenomena, I'd say, in all music, even in Western European music. That idea of putting your name to a piece is, and when I say modern, about 1,000 years old. So it's still modern in my historical head that people started putting their names to music. So you might ask, who owns this music? Who owns the spirituals? That question's actually been raised more and more. Who has the right to perform the music? Um, I grew up, of course, with the notion that, well, of course, if you can pick up a book and read it, you can read the music, you can sing it, and it's another question maybe, but I want to hold it in our head because in recent years, for instance, where I teach up at Yale at the Institute of Sacred Music, which is I'd say a 90%. I'm the only person of faculty, color faculty, regular faculty at the ISM, the Institute of Sacred Music. Students wrote a letter last summer saying, when are we going to deal with the white supremacy of what we're being taught and how we're being taught it? And included in that was a discussion of how maybe all white choirs or with white directors all together perform the music of African American people, in particular spirituals, let's say, and that they wanted to investigate that, the students. And have been having discussions over the last couple of years with different groups who are interested in how to approach music with respect and honor, and with being allowed to sing. I come down on the side of everyone needs to sing them, but we need to know the context out of which these songs come. It's very important to know whose song you're singing, especially coming from a more privileged place. I think that's one of my learnings over the last several years. So about the songs. Maybe 6,000 songs survive, 6,000 spirituals, songs to use in work, songs to use in play, songs to use in religious settings, songs to laugh, songs to cry with and mourn. One of the important aspects of African culture that was brought over by those people who were enslaved was the fact that music and dance aren't two separate things. Music and dance are absolutely conjoined in the culture from which many of the enslaved folks come. So you can't it's kind of like that division of body and spirit. Like you try to keep the two separate. It doesn't work with this music. I saw many of you clapping when I was playing. Of course, with latent zoomness, I couldn't tell if you were clapping on 1 and 3 or 2 and 4. I'm sure you were clapping on 2 and 4. And but you were responding to the music. Not to say that when I wasn't playing earlier, you weren't maybe moving your head, but when I usually play Bach, people typically don't, get up and maybe they should. Maybe they should. Okay, I'm here to tell you it's okay to do that. But when we're going to sing a song that I've learned from Africa, we're going to move. And in fact, we're not going to use the book to sing it. There's certain performance practices that are problematic in kind of thinking that the music is to be read and sitting down or standing up. The music is meant to embody and move, and that's just where it comes from. So that over the next few weeks, I'll get to share a little bit of my own story, which is that I grew up in all white church in northern New Jersey, in Mendham, New Jersey. So this is my own journey that I can talk about personally about how the music has kind of infiltrated how I've learned how to respond and be a leader with the music. By the way, anybody can, if you have a burning question, you could put it in the chat, and I'm going to try to quit speaking around 12:30 so we can have conversation, and then I'll maybe wrap up with some more words. So, what are the elements? What are the distinguishable elements of the spiritual? Are there? Well, you can't characterize. You can't say every single one has characteristics, but you can make some very defining characteristics over a broad number of the thousands of spirituals that we hear. Uh, they are short phrases. They're not long phrases, so they don't go, you know. If I was to sing something to that, or short phrases, glory, glory, hallelujah, since I laid my burden down, and the phrase they almost invariably start with a very memorable line that catches you. Um, right. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child, a long way from home, a long way from home. A line that grabs you. There's usually a strong biblical connection. It's interesting. I was watching a documentary with Henry Louis Gates, Skip Gates, last week on the Black Church. It's coming out on Tuesday and Wednesday of this week on PBS, and I would really urge you to check that out. But he told me something that I never really knew over all these years of teaching this, that a number of people who came over through the Middle Passage and who were enslaved, he said maybe about 15% were Muslim, and a number of people who were enslaved brought over from the Congo, which at the time part of the slave trade was under, was a Catholic king, were Catholic, were Roman Catholic, people being enslaved. So Abrahamic faith traditions were not unknown to a good portion of the folks, as well as, of course, the rich traditions of all the people that came over in the African religion. What I'm trying to say, though, is that it wasn't a tabula rasa of people coming over and being influenced in the colonies when that happened. But there were problems right away with trying to figure out how does Christianity square itself with these people who are enslaved. Some of the first people said, no, we cannot share Christianity with them the way we know it. That would give them too much power and maybe even literacy. But the early Episcopalians actually won over many of the magistrates and people who are holding slaves, and said, no, this is a good thing. We're going to help their spiritual condition. Of course, it's a great reason why we're enslaving people, because we bring them Christ. That was definitely one of the rationales. Of course, we realize what a hideously demonic rationale that is, but that was used. And then but with the caveat, and it was written into laws in the 16th, 17th century in the colonies, that just because you're baptized does not mean you're free. So, because of course the enslaved people were saying, yeah, let's become Christian because Once we're free in Christ, we're free. And they said, no, 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 not so fast. It just means spiritual freedom. On earth, you are still enchained. So how to reconcile what's happening with the condition with what's being learned in the religious tradition? Well, there's plenty in our religious tradition that obviously is about liberation, is about resisting the oppressed. And one of the characteristics that is found in songs of West Africa and in the spirituals is that the language used means more than one thing. It doesn't hold kind of a one-dimensional aspect. The language is coded and it has multiple meanings. So, for instance, well, I'm sure you've heard about this, but what did I start out with singing? I got shoes, you got shoes, all God's children got shoes. Want to get to heaven, gonna walk all over God's heaven, heaven. That song is a radical song of inclusivity. What does it mean that I have a crown, you've got a crown? And people who are hearing this from the outside, of course, are saying, "Oh, isn't that nice? They're talking about heaven." And I saw you, Reverend Bridget, shake your head. Everybody talking about heaven ain't going there. Heaven. That little line that gets slipped in there is subversive to the 10th degree. About, we hear a lot about people talking about who's going to heaven, but not everybody's going there. But that's a spiritual that has kind of a radical message baked into it. I'm going to lay down my sword and shield down by the riverside. Well, that's a great song about laying down your arms in peace, but it could also be a signal song to tell people where you're going. Of course, it's a famous song that Wade in the Water, that Harriet Tubman used that to help signal folks, to let them know she was nearby. So language having multiple meanings and encoded messages. Thank you. Call and response. Absolutely. Yes, Bridget, call and response. Well, I'm going to lay down my sword and shield. Where? And you all say, down by the riverside, down by the riverside, down by the riverside. I'm going to lay down my sword and shield. Exactly. Have you got good religion? Certainly, Lord. That's another response. Have you got good religion? Certainly, Lord. Have you got good religion? Certainly, Lord. Certainly, 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 Lord. Walk together, children. Walk together, children. Don't you get weary. Walk together, children. Don't you get weary. Walk together, children. Don't you get weary. And then the people say, there's a great camp meeting in the promised land. So call and response. Call and recall. The antiphonal idea of a leader and a responder. That is a big characteristic. The fact that the messages are eternal. There's a universality, as Y.T. Walker, the late Y.T. Walker, would say, that the eternity of the message is found in so many of these pieces. They're not nailed down to a specific context, but they are open for everyone to hear and to connect to. They are improvisatory. Improvisation is just a part of both African composing and in the spirituals. So, for instance, you might have a song, because refrain and chorus, verse and chorus were also a characteristic. D major, maybe. Every time I feel the Spirit moving in my heart, I will pray. Yes, every time I feel the the Spirit moving in my heart, I will pray. West End Avenue is chilly and cold. It chills the body, but not the soul. There's a cold wind blowing down the street, but I go to West End Church and I meet two good people I meet. Every time I feel the Spirit moving in my heart, I will pray. Yes, every time I feel the Spirit moving in my heart, I will pray. Reverend Bridget, she's got that hat, looks like a boa, but I don't mind that. It's a red for Valentine's Day. Will Kritzman says, hey, hey, hey. Every time I feel the Spirit moving in my heart, I will pray. Yes, every time I feel the Spirit moving in my heart, I will pray. Yeah. So if I don't get invited back next week, you'll know I went out with a bang. Thanks, Will and Bridget. I'll get you next time, Sam. Don't worry. But yes, so improvisation is baked in, but you see how improvisation moves within a structure. So you set up the structure and then you improvise in it. I mean, it's not that this isn't happening in other musical structures, but this has its own context and where the improvisation happens and how it happens. The harmonies are open to. I think one of the reasons why the spirituals become bedrock for musical expression that becomes the country of America is because of their openness to fitting in new genres, if that makes sense. Now, they also bring innovations in ways that had not been seen in other musical expressions. For instance, there's a third. You have this. Let me see if I can show my. Yeah. Right. You have a regular scale that goes up. The diatonic scale that European music is based on. Well, the spirituals do not follow that. I mean, some do, but some don't. And the introduction of right, you just say, well, that's a minor scale. That's not a big deal. But it would go from minor to major, and it would be considered a flatted third, and the same thing with a seventh instead of, and they would appear they wouldn't always they would be musical embellishments or flourishes that would happen, and those embellishments and flourishes weren't allowed in the rules of Western European music, and yet they appear, and they pull and shape the music in a way that makes it a totally new experience. In fact, it's the basis of the blues, it's the basis of jazz, it's the basis of rock and roll, it's the basis of most of our American music today. There's a spiritual called "There's a Balm in Gilead." I love this piece, and I'll sing a verse of it, and then I had arranged a kind of a more introspective jazz version. I want you to listen to the chord changes. Now, it's important to remember we listen with 21st century ears, so there wasn't piano accompaniment happening when these spirituals were happening. These spirituals were from the body of people, the singing voices, or the percussion that came from being able to slap your body or stomp the ground or take a stick. Drums were forbidden early on, but later on, maybe a drum. But these songs, well, they came from a vocal place. Now we hear them with European harmonies that have been placed on them. But there is a balm in Gilead to make the wounded whole. There is a balm in Gilead to heal the sin-sick soul. Sometimes I feel discouraged and think my work's in vain. But then the Holy Spirit revives my soul again. There is a balm in Gilead to make the wounded whole. There is a balm in Gilead to heal the sin-sick soul. If you cannot preach like Peter, if you cannot pray like Paul, just tell the love of Jesus and say he died for all. There is a balm in Gilead to make the wounded whole. There is a balm in Gilead to heal the sin-sick soul. These songs were being sung in invisible spaces. In fact, it was known as the invisible church, despite the fact that people of color, black folks who were enslaved, became Christians and sometimes attended, it depended, service, listening from the outside of a building, or maybe in the North being in the back of a building or in the gallery, that black folks were having their own religious services, and they were having them in secret and private in what was called the brush arbors, or, in the outdoors. They would use different techniques to keep the sound from carrying, holding up sheets or using a big pot full of water that would capture sound. And that's where these songs were sung and enacted. And as I said, body and music went together. Music and dance were inseparable. In fact, let me see if I could show you just a quick clip of what is called a ring shout. The ring shout came, it's direct antecedent in African culture, this idea of movement in a circle that might start slow and gain in speed. The fact that this practice was incorporated into Christian practices was fascinating, and it still exists today, although many people have tried to stamp it out. mainline denominational black churches early on said, trying to distance themselves from slavery, enslaved people, a seeming idea of ignorance around Christianity, wanted to separate that, not realizing the great cultural gift it was. All right. You better put a ring shout in your plays, Reverend Bridget. Let's see, I'm going to have to change my video over to FaceTime there, and then share my screen to here with sound. There we go.
You got a right to the tree of life. You got a right, you got a right. You got a right to the tree of life. You got a right, you got a right. You got a right to the tree of life. Ups and down, but you got a right. You got a right to the tree of life. Sure and all gone, but you got a right. You got a right to the tree of life. You got a right, you got a right. You got a right to the tree of life. You got a right to the tree of life. Run, Mary, run. Oh, Lord. Run, Martha, run. Oh, Lord. Hail Mary, run, I say. You got a right to the tree of life. You got a right, you got a right. You got a right to the tree of life. You got a right, you got a right. You got a right to the tree of life. You got a right, you got a right. You got a right to the tree of life.
Yeah, listen to that.
Adam in the garden picking up leaves. Oh, Eve, where is Adam? Oh, Eve, Adam in the garden picking up leaves. Oh, Adam, picking up leaves. Adam, picking up leaves. Who told you Adam? Picking up leaves. Yeah, you was picking up leaves. Who told you Adam?
Yes, I want you to hear the second song there, Adam in the garden picking up leaves, and you. I heard a keyboard at the end of that. Someone couldn't help themselves and just put a little harmony in there that would be kind of a modern innovation. But fascinating things happening in that ring shout. The words, run, Mary, run, run, Martha, run. What are they saying? You've got a right to the tree of life. What a fascinating theological conflation of, I think of running Mary and Martha from the grave of Jesus, resurrection, or maybe running to tell him Lazarus has died. But I think resurrection might be a powerful piece. And then the tree of life. What? that's in Genesis garden, or that's Revelation, but you have got a right to the tree of life. So you see how the spirituals take these Bible stories and fashion them to the understanding that maybe Jesus' resurrection, the Garden of Eden, the tree of life, in Revelation, this is for us. It's not just for a certain part of people, but it's a wild and I think radical understanding of the Bible in its entirety to manage to take stories and bring out the liberation message that's there. That second song, Adam in the Garden Picking Up Leaves. Oh, Eve, where is Adam? Adam in the garden picking up leaves. So the call and response. It could be used as a work song, obviously, picking up leaves, picking up tobacco leaves, picking up, doing our work, but it becomes it has liturgical implications, but the call and response is a question and an answer too, and I appreciate that. It's like an embodiment of a story to make it real. It didn't happen then; it's happening now. Moses didn't lead. Moses and Miriam did not lead the people then. It's happening now. We believe this story is now. It reminds me, I get to teach a course in world religion, music of world religions at Drew, and Wesley Aryaraja, one of the great theologians from Sri Lanka, who spent many years at Drew Theological School where I taught, said that they were trying to proselytize a Hindu. Wesley grew up in Hindu culture, obviously, and they gave him the Gospels to read and said, read this and you'll understand the truth. And the Hindu man came back several days later and said, "Oh, wow, this is just amazing. Thank you so much for giving me these Gospels. I understand them fully now, that in Matthew, Jesus has this life and then he dies and then he comes back in Mark and then he dies again and comes back in Luke. And finally in John, he attains this nirvana." And be careful of how you give someone a religious text, because they're going to interpret it in their context, which is what they should do. Our job is to make Hindus better Hindus, I believe. But so I'm going to I'm going to open it up to some of your questions or comments. And Sam, I see off the back you say theological implications of non-diatonic music is powerful. From a sacred music perspective, could you say more about how the way we worship with changes with the flatted third and the flatted seventh? Yes, it is a powerful concept, because it helps deconstruct the hierarchy of music that has been used to say this is the music we use to worship God. And now, of course, this you might think of European spaces where this has happened, but if we were to talk about the song "Precious Lord, Take My Hand, Lead Me On, Let Me Stand," the song by Thomas Dorsey, "Precious Lord," was originally shunned and banned by black denominational churches, saying that music is not sacred. It belongs in the club, or it doesn't belong in church. And it took people's imagination, I would say, liturgical imagination, to realize that God is speaking through that music. It happens today, right? Or it happened, let's say, with Kirk Franklin, the 1990s. But now, when I go back to Yale, these are hard spaces to crack, where a hierarchy has been set up to say this is legitimate music, and what music that would use flatted thirds and flatted sevenths is okay, but it's lower music. And I've got a statement at the end of today that I want to read to you that's kind of fun. I want to interrogate that understanding of what is good music. But at the same time, Sam, with congregations fully engaging in different types of music, again, my not warning, but concern would be that it's not used lightly, that it's used with the understanding that this music comes from a place that comes from a place where people were crushed, were treated with the most unholy of ways for hundreds of years. Like not just a generation, or you were enslaved and your children go free. No, that's chattel slavery, right? That your children and their children and their children and their children and their children, like 12 generations. That that creates a music that needs to be treated as holy and sacred.
Um, Mark, can I just tell you real quick that somebody has their hand raised?
Oh,
Judy Maisels
yes.
maybe wants to ask a question. I don't want to interrupt. Just
No,
let
no,
you.
and please do. Thank you so much for that, and you can help me moderate too. Thanks for keeping an eye on that too.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
I read somewhere that when the music was finally being written down, it was the missionaries, and the words were a little racier and raunchier, and how the missionaries changed the lyrics of a lot of these songs to make them a little calmer. Is that?
I don't know about that, Judy. The first book that actually published anything uh, like the Negro Spirituals, 1865. Lucy McKinnon went down as a kind of a before they had ethnomusicologists. That's what she did, and she started writing down. And from what I can tell, I haven't heard that she tried to do that, but her purposes weren't to create religious music for people to listen to. And looking through that book, it's surprising how many songs aren't of a religious nature. I mean, the spirituals were across the board, all for every part of life, and not the ones I'm talking about are sacred music. But I mean, I might consider all of them sacred, but the text necessarily wasn't. So that might very well be true, and I'd be interested to find out more about that. What does Sam's question mean for the rest of us non-musical folks? Well, for me, all music is sacred, obviously. So you could say that just like we want to treat every human being with respect and love and honor them, honor their story, uh, that's just the way we would want to treat music. The problem, of course, is when music leaders get trained a certain way, then they learn to discount other music, or say, oh, well, our youth and children can do that because it's peppy or fun. And that, that that's discriminatory, and it's not treating the music as. Now other music leaders, and me included, would say, I don't think I'm trained in that. Like, I don't think I actually can bring the skills to play that. What happens then? Well, you are going to learn and you're going to and you're going to have folks, you're going to lift up folks that can help you learn and can help lead. Just like in any community, there's gifts given to certain people. It's interesting what shared leadership means. It's also interesting, just off the top of my head, thinking about the proliferation of gospel choirs in mostly white church spaces over the last 20 plus years, is a coming to terms with that, saying, how do we lift up and honor this music in spaces that traditionally have not done that? And that's one. It's one way. I worked at Marble Collegiate Church for a number of years, directing the gospel choir at Marble Collegiate from 2002 to 2007, I guess it was. And I had a collegial and wonderful relationship with Ken Dake, the director of music. Uh, but even so, it's difficult in a space that is uh, immersed in hundreds of years of one musical idiom to say, our congregation is changing, and it might mean that we're going to change too. It's a conversation many places are having. So, oh, any more questions? Because Bridget, yours is lingering too. I see Susan. You want to go next, and then
Yeah, I'm just curious, who are the decision makers of who categorizes what is sacred and what is not music? I mean, is there a board? I mean, who are they?
that's a wonderful question. Just like with all institutions, there is a board of publishers that publish music, sacred music, for mainline denominations that say this is worthy of our hymnal, and they have big fights and battles, and just like most institutions these days, they're in crisis and falling apart.
Right.
And the gate to what is made sacred is as wide as your YouTube bandwidth. You can go on and decide what's sacred.
Yeah.
And but it's a great question you raised because I was involved in a project called Convergence Music Project,
Mm.
which says, our mainline denominations aren't moving fast enough in publishing music that is progressive, theologically nuanced, and with depth and understanding, and we need to do it. So let's just start a company and do this, and we'll vet the music ourselves. So, but you're right. Who are the gatekeepers of what is sacred and how you create a culture of what you
Mhm.
decide to use? It has to be the community. Like the community has to discern what what their sound is going to be, and of course, for that you need leadership that's going to come from your congregation and your leaders who help discern the sound, where it is and where it's going.
Thank you.
There's
Thank you.
another question from Pat.
Hi. The folk music that I hear sometimes played in church when they have a video system. Now, what makes that religious versus not religious? Or is it just the design of it? Like Susan says, we're transferring types of music. I'm not even sure that's quite the right question, but
That's a great question. When when uh, when you're down and troubled and you need a helping hand, nothing, oh, nothing is going right. What would make that song sacred in church? Well, it all depends, my perspective, on context. So, you've got a friend or any other piece of music that you might hear on the radio and think, oh, that's not church music or sacred. Becomes sacred by how we place it into a context that makes it sacred. So it really depends on context. Now, at the same time, uh, let's say the Klan, the Ku Klux Klan, ends its rally with "Amazing Grace." That's kind of a well-known thing that's how they used to end the meeting, with singing "Amazing Grace." Now, you would consider when you hear "Amazing Grace," you're like, "Oh yeah, that's a sacred song, right? That's about God." And but in a context of then you have to question it and say, I don't know if that song is sacred in that context. Um,
interesting.
I saw Charapko.
Catherine.
Catherine or Peter? Did you guys have?
Yeah, it was me. It was me. I noticed that in the video that you showed, the person calling out was a woman, and it was mostly women dressed in white, dancing, etc. What was the traditional relationship between men and women in these sorts of songs? Was
That's a
was there a
that's a great question, and it's one I don't know the answer to, other than I don't think the earliest gatherings were separated. Um, and in fact, from early accounts of the revival sweeping the Great Awakening, sweeping the colonies in the early 18th century, there some of the revival camp meetings had maybe separate sections, but they were all kind of together, men and women. They were notable for me because white and black people were worshiping together in those outdoor spaces. Uh, but I would have to think that there was some co-ed between men and women, between different genders happening early on. And I know, thank you. Yeah, great question. I know Ruby had her hand up before as well.
Ruby and then Peter as well.
Okay, and I see you,
And did I
Julia,
say
but I don't
Nathan?
know if that's you, Julia, but
No, just Ruby and then Peter.
okay.
Miss Ruby, are you there?
They might have gone off for just a minute. Do you want to have Peter go?
Peter, go ahead with your question. Not Peter Chiraco, Peter Julia
Peter
Turner.
Odom. Peter, there you go. And you're unmuted now.
Okay, thank you so much. This has been a fascinating session. I'm curious as to why it is that the American experience, or the North American experience perhaps, of slavery resulted in slaves who became Christianized. And I used to live in Brazil, and in Brazil, they had a similar slave experience, but the old religions continue on. There are priestesses of Macumba, for example, who carry on the traditional languages. Doesn't mean that Catholicism, of course, has been very successful in Brazil, but what was the difference? Where did the old religions go?
Here in the States.
In the States.
They're in the music. Yeah, W.E.B. Du Bois has a wonderful comment to say that the music of the spirituals is older than the words. The music, the melodies and the way they get interpreted came over, and you could say that the spirituals is a part of traditional. It connects to the home continent, the motherland in some ways, but your question of why traditional religions didn't continue on, two reasons that I can think of, just as having read some about the history. The brutality of slavery can't be, you can't underestimate the complete and utter whitewashing of a person's humanity that happened in slavery. Now to say that those traditions weren't kept, well, let's say the Geechee and Gullah traditions in the islands off of Georgia have preserved their way of life, which is heavily influenced through the African culture and American culture. So some places it did, but also I would say, owing to the success of the early Methodists and Baptists to convert those enslaved people and free black people in the northern states, those enslaved people took the religion seriously and said, Christianity has something to offer us, because it really is about liberation, and this is, I believe in Jesus. I believe in Jesus as someone who is worthy to follow. So, but your question's deep, and it's that it would take more than my guess to figure that out. It's a wonderful question. Why that is. Bridget, you have something to ask?
Yeah, I just wanted to say too, you've already touched on, it's about geography as well. Enslaved persons who are in Brazil or in certain areas were able to hold on to some of those African traditions in a way that enslaved persons here in America were not. Like you said, Mark, the brutality, very specific to the American chattel slavery was very complete. Like there was very little chance to sort of hold on to original names of gods or traditions or things like that. Whereas Brazil, which was sort of one of the first stops as opposed to the third or fourth stop in the Atlantic slave trade, people were maybe able to hold on to some of those memories, hold on to some of those traditions. And because it was geographically more isolated, they were able to sort of share and keep some of those traditions alive better. So you have like Santeria and all those different things in Brazil, but here in America, like the dehumanization was, you were really sort of stripped of any connection to the motherland. So it's about geography as well, I think.
And Taropko, you go ahead.
Oh, yes. In North America, and particularly Eastern United States, Eastern colonies, there was the triangulation of the slave, cotton, rum. I might have this incorrect, but it was a relatively short triangular thing that became very, very intense. And it relied upon the British Empire as its backup. This intensified it. Continental colonies, very small geography compared to Brazil. And I could give you citations on this from a very good friend of mine who was a historian at Harvard. His name happens to be Hancock. But I'm just going to leave it there because I kind of am always an accidental historian. I'm not an actual historian, but I know historians, okay. And I've carefully read some of their books. And so I think there is a distinction and a reason. And I think when Bridget mentions geography, what I am citing is hinged to that as well.
Yes, thank you for that comment on the triangular trade. Okay, friends, so I have just a couple comments for you that I've been thinking about, and I want to share a little bit. It gives you a little insight into how I come about this. So for many years, I envisioned my music skills and my leadership in liturgy and the academy as being a bridge builder. I say that because I'm a person of color, because I'm gay, raised in mostly white, mostly straight spaces all my life. If I felt like if I was to have any effectiveness with the powers that be, I'd need to be able to be relatable, to be a congenial presence, to so that I could see myself in those who were different than me, and people could see themselves as relating to me. And so the music I would compose would help connect and build something different, and help build the beloved community. But so over the course of all these years, I've done this, but kind of with the understanding that the system to which I was accountable for and always had worked for had been pretty much white dominated and controlled. And from my own experience, that was a benign, kindly system that worked to do that. And I felt a little bit of my naive head down and working with that. Over the years, of course, that worldview began to shift. And in particular, I started thinking in 2014 where the Methodist Church, which I belong to, the United Methodist Church, became very actively hostile against the LGBT community and started stripping ministers. A good friend of mine of his ordination when he tried to marry his son and his partner. If you remember then, grand juries also decided to not press charges in the case of Eric Garner and Michael Brown. In 2015, I was at Montreat leading music down for the Presbyterian Conference in North Carolina when I heard the news that 9 people had been shot and killed at Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston. And literally, I was in an auditorium leading music. There was maybe 700 people there in Anderson Auditorium, and I was one of 5 or 6 Black people in that 700 or 800 auditorium people. And I suddenly felt, for the first time in my life, not sure I was safe. 2016, the murders of Philando Castile and Alton Sterling, and then the election. I began to ask myself, were the moving songs that I composed just enabling us to feel better, enabling white Christians to feel better about themselves, and the implicit involvement that I have in this entrenched system of racism and sexism and homophobia? Was my worship leading just a subtler way of propagating the supremacy of those spaces? So those are the hard questions I had been asking myself this past year. But through it all, I feel like I haven't lost faith in my understanding of where I teach and where I lead worship, that I still love the church. MLK's letter to the Birmingham jail helps me with that. You know, through it all, I love the church. I love the message of Jesus. It's justice making, it's death defying. It's about, as Will said, it's just one word. It really is love. So I say all this to say that I've had a new revelation this past year of how I want to make music. And it's tied directly to these spirituals. And now, instead of, yes, I want to be a bridge builder, but more than that, I want to use Harriet Tubman as my mentor. I want to carry people over to safety like I've been carried over. How do I write it? I say, as a bridge builder, perhaps that's been my mission all along. But as an academic, liturgical, musical liberator, I want to be part of an underground railroad, a vehicle to carry people to safety and rescue. And the type of rescue transcends geographical boundaries and institutional places. I want to be passionate, I want to be playful, but I want to be subversive and intentional, and hope to open all of our eyes to the death-dealing oppression of our present location in our church and society, and our need to create a new home, to find a new home. And I think honesty and vulnerability and trust are needed on that underground railroad. And although the work is dangerous and not for the faint of heart, I feel like it's really the only journey worth taking. So, thank you.
So Mark, that you can make incredible music and teach us this lesson is all fine, but that you can also preach like you just did now has me really worried. We're so lucky to have you and your talents in our midst this month as our guest artist for this month, bringing us music and history and lessons and a heart. Thank you for that. Friends, this has been a wonderful after church session today. It's so good to see so many of you sticking around. We'll continue this conversation next week with thanks to Mark and to Bridget and Sam and all of you for being here. Be well, and we will see you on Wednesday when Into the Ashes we will go.